Okay, so attachment styles and Dharma. So you can all hear me, right? You can hear me? Yeah, okay. So for me, this is a very interesting topic, and I'm sure for some of you as well. I mean, I'm not a student of psychology, but I have studied counseling to some extent, and monks and nuns are kind of de facto counselors, and I'm, refining my skills as a counselor as well. To begin with, I think people probably have sometimes the wrong idea of what Buddhism really is, in the sense that they think Buddhism is a solitary spiritual path that has nothing, and that attachment or love or anything in normal life is bad. And if you want to have a relationship or, have sex or earn money, then you must be a bad Buddhist. But actually, or feel emotions or need other people. But actually, most Buddhists are lay people. And even in a monastery, you have relationships with people. You need people. So I'm just moving this little box here so I can see Nilam's pretty, I shouldn't say pretty face, should I? I'm objectifying you. You're a wonderful presence. So, yes, it all starts. The premise of attachment theory is that as babies, we're absolutely dependent on our parent. So that first relationship, especially with the mother or someone who's like a mother, a caregiver, father, whoever is raising us, that as a child, you're going through a lot of emotional changes. You're learning to regulate emotions. You've got a lot of neurons firing. You've got a lot of chaos and change in your body. And over time, you develop a sense of personhood, and you learn how to regulate emotions and form attachments. But unfortunately, in 50% of the cases of children, their caregiver, probably because of intergenerational trauma, doesn't form a good attachment bond or doesn't give them their basic needs. And it's not just about food and shelter and having your nappy changed. I mean, that's obviously very fundamental, but it's more than that. It's empathy. It's the ability to see yourself reflected in someone else and see how they react to your emotions and your feelings and your needs. And if they react with empathy and can hold space for those emotions without shaming you, without distracting you, like, don't worry about that emotion, it doesn't matter, let's just play with this toy, then they don't feel supported, they don't feel held. If they let you cry without comforting you, and as a toddler, as you grow up, it gets more complex, because when you hold a baby, they actually pick up on energy, they pick up on emotions and anxiety in the body. So if a mother is very tense and she picks up the baby's more likely to sense that and probably cry more. But if the mother is able to just be calm and hold space for whatever is happening, even if it's crying for the 10th time today, the baby is more likely to settle down more quickly. I've always noticed that children start playing up when their parents are fighting or when there's unsaid things in the room. I watched a very interesting doco about this mother who hadn't been mothered properly. And she had a baby, and the child became very angry and full of rage and, throwing tantrums. And they got to the point where it was so bad, they almost thought of giving up the child just because they were afraid she was going to become delinquent, and even the school didn't want her and the preschool didn't want her. And she just went to this psychologist at the end of her rope. And the psychologist said, it's the parent. You need to look at how you were mothered and how you're holding space for your child. Are you helping her process her emotions and develop a secure attachment? And as she grows up, that she'll be able to regulate her own emotions. Because the mother was feeling rage at, my time has been stolen by my child. Why won't my child behave? I don't feel loved. I wasn't loved as a child. I don't know how to be a mother. Like this kind of anxiety she was feeling. And as soon as she started working on her own issues, like the psychologist said, do you touch your child? Do you comfort her? Do you warn her when there's going to be a consequence for her actions? Do you set clear boundaries and create a clear structure for her and a routine so that you're not just slapping her out of nowhere? You're actually saying, well, if you do this, the consequence will be I cut your pocket money or you can't watch TV tonight. And over time, as this woman started to examine how she was mothered and start learning to comfort her child, hug her child, hold space for her child, and not shame her child, the child completely changed. Of course, it's really hard, it's a learning process, and no one should be shamed because often it's the way we were brought up that we don't know how to comfort our own children. If we grew up in a chaotic place, or a place where emotions and love weren't shown, or we grew up in an abusive family where there wasn't safety, that can affect our parenting style. And it's not just the relationship we have with our children, it's the relationship we have with everyone, friends, family, romantic partners, and there's three basic attachment types, which is attachment avoidant, which is the person who is like the child who wasn't comforted, the classic little boy the boy who cried and wasn't held. And a child that isn't held basically learns, okay, my emotions and my needs are not going to be met. I'm not safe. Therefore, I'm going to become stoic. I'm not going to become vulnerable, because being vulnerable and not getting your needs met is painful. So I'm going to emotionally shut down, and I'm going to go into my own little world, and I'm not going to need anyone, and I'm never going to show my emotions, and I'm going to minimize emotions. I'm going to shut my heart down, and I'm not going to be able to value other people's emotions because my own emotional needs weren't met. That's attachment avoidant. And attachment avoidant, as they grow up, would be someone who goes into their room all the time, doesn't socialize, doesn't reach out to people when they need help, and feels smothered. That can also happen, like if you have a parent who treats you like a confidant, who treats you like another adult, like they're going through a divorce and they confide in you, your father's such a da-da-da, and, I feel so abandoned, I feel so lonely. And they're bringing you into their adult world before you're ready to deal with that. And you feel, or, maybe a very emotionally needy parent or sibling, and you feel smothered, you feel overwhelmed. Or maybe another factor could be if your parent is highly emotional, and when you tell them a small thing, like a boy hit me at school today, they're like blowing up, So then you learn to lie, to minimize, to hide things, because you've been shown that when you share something, when you share an emotion or something that happened, your parent will overreact. So that could also be another cause for attachment avoidant. Or a child who is shamed for having needs, or like a child who's crying a lot, and then the parent says, you think you got problems? I'm going to give you something to really cry about. When I was a child, we had this happen, and, your feelings don't matter, basically. This is attachment avoidant. And it's also in the way that we raise, particularly in patriarchy, in the way we raise boys. Boys don't cry. Like, in fact, boys cry as much as girls until the age of 7. And then they start to be shamed for that. They start to be shamed for showing vulnerability, showing emotions, being unsure, needing guidance, loving their mother, because the feminine is denigrated. And if you love your mother, you're a pussy. If you respect women, you're a pussy. So that's that process of emotionally brutalizing boys and turning them into emotionally shut down people, which leads to a suicide epidemic in men, or rage, because those men were not able to learn healthy ways to regulate their emotions. And then on the other extreme, there is anxious attachment. So This is someone who maybe their parent recognized their emotional states part of the time, but part of the time their emotional needs weren't met. You know, for example, maybe you had a depressed parent who was kind of off in their own needs, or maybe that your parent was being abused. They couldn't recognize what was going on for you. For example, if you had a disabled brother or sister, if you had an abusive person in your family, if you had money troubles, then you kind of grow up thinking, well, my emotions might create more tension in the family, so I better not mention them. I better not take up space. I don't feel safe to have my emotional needs met, so I'm just going to, you know, like it creates anxiety in you to express emotion because you're worried you're going to be rejected, that your emotions aren't going to be held. And there are also people who become addicted to love, addicted to relationships. Like they get that hit of dopamine and adrenaline from being in love and being connected, and they feel all of their unmet emotional needs being met, being held, and they become addicted to that, you know, because they can't actually regulate themselves. That's actually part of the problem of borderline personality disorder. They don't have a sense of identity, and they need other people to define them. So they get into codependent relationships. Yeah, so, you know, with people with attachment anxiety pattern, they're always needing reassurance from their partner, and they easily feel rejected. You know, like the partner doesn't call you for a week. You're like, oh my God, where are you? What's happened? Are we okay? Are we breaking up? You know, I mean, a week is a fairly long time to not call your partner, but yeah, people can make something bigger in their head, and they start to worry about feelings because they haven't been taught safe ways to process feelings. And then the optimum attachment pattern is secure attachment pattern, where the child cries, the mother touches the child relaxes, or the father or whoever. The child has eye contact, their physical needs are met, the mother is relaxed, the caregiver relaxes, and then the child can relax. And the child feels held and understood, and they can process and let go of their feeling. You know, and over time the neurons fire, and then they form mental pathways. You know, they form either healthy or unhealthy mental pathways. And this child who's going through so many emotional, mental, physical changes starts to develop a sense of identity. You know, and as they become a toddler, the mother will say, like, the child, it feels more than it can say. You know, so he's crying, and he's got a tear coming down his face, and you're like, the mother tries to, or the caregiver tries to verbalize, like, are you sad because your brother stole your toy? Or are you sad because we said we'd go to the park, but Grandpa broke his leg and we couldn't go? Something like that. Like, are you sad because the dog didn't want to play with you? You know, and when the child will shrug off until they hear what their emotional state is, and something miraculous happens when their emotional state is empathized, mirrored back to them. They see themselves through their parents' eyes. So if your parent is saying, you're a spoiled brat, you better shut up, you better be grateful, you better be a good girl. Or if your parent is saying, oh, you're such a whinger, you know, you're such a prissy little boy, you know, whatever it is, you're developing your identity on what they're mirroring back to you. Whereas if your parent is showing you empathy, and they're showing you, they're not freaking out about your emotions, they're not getting enraged, they're not constantly distracting you, they're not telling you that you're only valuable because of your talents or your beauty or your good behavior. They're just allowing you to be yourself. You develop a healthy way to process your emotions, in the sense that it's recognized, it's empathized, it's integrated, and we move on. That's why being a parent is probably the hardest job in the world, actually. And I don't think they should really let people have children without doing some kind of counseling course. And this is why later on we develop so many problems if we weren't parented well, if we didn't get our basic emotional needs met, if we didn't have a secure attachment with that fundamental carer, you know. I've been watching this series called Soft White Underbelly, which is about, on YouTube, it's about people who get addicted to drugs, people who are become pimps, gang members on Skid Row in LA. It's pretty rough. But what is so interesting and what is a common thread throughout all of these stories of addicts and homeless people and quite dysfunctional, violent people having a really hard life, they all mostly had really something traumatic happened in their childhood. They were molested, or, their parents were on drugs, or their parents were emotionally unavailable, their father abandoned the family. Something happened, and they, instead of getting that love they needed, that secure attachment they needed from a parent, they get that sense of love and fulfillment and safety in drugs. Something went wrong with that emotional bond, that emotional attachment, that secure attachment. And of course, in every relationship, things come and go. It's nice to feel close to someone and you feel connected. And then, you have to go to work and you have to go away and do some things and you have to maintain your own life and your own emotions. So a person with secure attachment can move in and out of that bond of closeness, and then moving back into your own life and not feeling like the relationship will be over or the love will never be found again. Whereas a person with anxious attachment would be like, can you call me? Can you let me know we're okay? Feeling a sense of fear and anxiety that maybe that person won't be there, or can I trust this person? And an avoidant person is, not always able to show emotion, not always able to connect in. And the other partner is like not feeling that they're really present, because they're, just in their own world, not really knowing what's going on for them, and losing connection in that way. Whereas, a healthy emotional attachment can be, we both have our own lives, but I'm emotionally available for you, and we sit down and discuss how we are. And I actually think this is also a quality needed in Dharma teachers, in sanghas, in friendships. If you have a friend who never talks to you, never empathizes with you, it's not going to be a great friendship. Some relationships are based on one person chasing another person, begging them to love them, and the other person kind of feeling a bit overwhelmed that the other person is too needy. But the interesting thing is that it's in one relationship you might be attachment avoidant because the other person's emotions may feel too overwhelming to you, and in another relationship you may feel that you're the pursuer, that you're the one who's anxious about being loved. So the roles can change according to your emotional patterns. So we kind of have this idea in Buddhism that, we shouldn't need anyone, that emotions are temporary defilements, that we shouldn't have too much desire, that we should just be peaceful and a bit disconnected from the world, and we become liberated. It's nice in theory. It's depending on how painful your emotions are. But the reality is that it's normal to feel emotions. Humans are hardwired for connection and for emotion. So the question is, how do we develop a healthy relationship with our emotions and with the people around us? And it has to be much more subtle than emotions are impermanent and therefore I just keep breathing and I don't pay much attention to them. It's got to be more like you've got to develop a secure attachment pattern with your own heart, so to speak. So in meditation, these feelings are coming up and you acknowledge them. You're like the mother there. You're like the caretaker. They come up, you hold space for them, you embrace them, you feel the feeling, and then they kind of unravel on their own with your kind, embodied attentiveness to them. But there will be some emotions that are just too big, some trauma that's just too painful, and that's where body work is so useful. Like you feel it in your body, because the body doesn't lie. We create a storyline of, like, when you get triggered from past trauma, someone does something that makes you so angry, and that your anger Like you're so angry maybe that someone's dog did a poo on your lawn, and you just want to go out there with an axe and axe them in the head. You know that it's really got nothing to do with the dog and the poo. It's really got to do with some feeling of violation from your past. So sitting down with those feelings and what is that rage in my body? What is this sensation? Working with those sensations in your body. And over time, you kind of start to understand what your patterns are, what your trauma is. And you're just being present with that with a loving heart. And it kind of has a way of unraveling itself. But I think... I think the beautiful thing about meditation is we kind of learn to get perspective. We learn to neither suppress nor act out on our strong feelings. Although with time, we may recognize I'm being abused, or I have an unhealthy attachment pattern. And we may realize there are changes we need to make in our lives, boundaries we need to set, addictions we need to give up. Meditation makes you aware of these things, and meditation also makes you aware that you can feel a feeling without it killing you, without it, or some suffering, and it can change. So you develop a bit of perspective, like you can choose to engage with the thought or not. And you have, you create a bit of space, you create a bit of peace, a container, you purify the mind a bit, and you create a container to process difficult things. Because I think peace and happiness and having your basic needs met are a kind of fundamental foundation for the kind of spiritual work that a lot of Buddhist teachers are talking about. And if you don't have that, for example, you're homeless, you don't have a livable wage, your life is under threat, you're in an abusive relationship, then until you have those basic needs met, it's very hard to go into the kind of work that they're talking about. And of course, because they're mostly privileged white people, they assume that everybody's fine and we just can fix our problems in our mind. But no, actually, if someone doesn't have their basic needs met, or if someone is living under terrible structural violence, that's a great obstacle to having spiritual growth happen. And that is why we need to address those issues, for people to even think beyond survival. Yeah. And, in terms of, like, people say, well, why do we, in Buddhism, they're like, attachment is not a great thing if you're too attached. Do we really need other people? Shouldn't we be giving up desire? But I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding. The idea of being desireless or not, or being completely content and self-reliant, the goal of enlightenment is a very long-term aim, and you need to know relative teachings to where you are and the goal. And I don't think the goal is to be emotionless, loveless, not connected to anyone, crash dummy. People who are enlightened are not some kind of cut off, disconnected crash dummy. They're very joyous, very compassionate. The Buddha spent his whole life after enlightenment wandering around different communities. He ordained women, people from the Dalit community, poor people. He mixed with everyone. He was very much invested in compassion, ethics, community. And he said community is an important support for the spiritual life, for the life of waking up, of finding joy, of finding deep, lasting happiness and deep meaning and connection and benevolence and wholeness, healing, So when I hear people say things like emotions don't matter or attachment is delusion, I think it's a massive oversimplification of the spiritual path, and you have to remember, well, are you speaking ultimate or are you speaking relative? And there is quite a large problem in Buddhism with spiritual bypassing, which is the use of spiritual ideas to avoid doing the difficult work of being human, of feeling your feelings, of addressing injustice and oppression, of going through basic stages of development in your life. I see it very often on Facebook in living communities where somebody's going through something and someone will dismiss what they're saying. And that's, in a way, also part of avoidant attachment style. There's heaps of Buddhists with that avoidant attachment style. A lot of them ordain, actually, because they think, great, the world is so painful, the world breaks my heart, so I don't want to be involved, one, in those messy relationships where you get all up in somebody's business and you're afraid they're going to abandon you. I don't want to be part of that. That's painful. The world is painful. People are cruel to each other. I don't want any part of that. I'm going to go and live in a hut, in a forest, and I'm going to feel safe. Just me. But then you get to the hut in the forest and all your pain is still there, you know. And then, you know, they're asking you to interact with these other people who are also slightly crazy and wounded, you know. And you see pretty quickly that, yeah, that there's real problems with communication and interpersonal relationships. And that we need to learn to not only hold space for our own emotions, but to hold space for others, you know. Because a lot of our wounding happens in relationships, so our healing will also happen in relationship. It's a good thing when you can learn to just listen to someone, to hold space for someone without judging, and they feel heard, you know. That in itself is healing, without offering advice, without interrupting, you know, or just being not activated, not reacting, you know, just being a cool, clear mirror so that they feel heard, they feel respected, they feel understood. And then maybe mirroring back is, I'm seeing this, is this what it is for you? And then finally in wrapping up, you know, so what do you think you could do to change this now that you're aware of it, you know? Yeah. But, you know, so many problems come because a child was not properly parented. And sadly, we don't have to blame, because probably our parents weren't properly parented either. And there are a lot of things going on, like epidemics, wars, abuse, you know, poverty, a lot of things going on that people didn't have control of. But definitely, you know, children pick up on their parents' anxiety, the tension in the family. And it's the difference between becoming a mess or becoming, you know, a well-adjusted person who is capable of emotional regulation, basically. How are we going for time? Oh, yeah, 20. 27 minutes, yeah, okay. I'm just looking if there's any notes that I've missed. Yeah, and that's why I think romantic relationships are so compelling, you know, and kind of addictive, and sometimes so dysfunctional and painful, because they mirror our early relationships with our caregiver, you know, and they're meeting some of our very deep emotional needs. And even, you know, you see in a Buddhist community or in a monastery, family dynamics playing out, you know. Yeah, but it can be so satisfying when someone hears and sees and validates your feeling. But yeah, it's also important to know whether the feeling, as an adult, whether the feeling is healthy or you know, whether it's coming from a place of being the right perspective. I mean, for example, you know how they bring people into white supremacist groups, you know, or like a hate group, you know, like a Nazi group or a fundamentalist Hindu group where we hate on someone. It's often not just that the people who go into these groups are hateful from the start. You know, maybe they're just a little bit lost. They're a little bit socially disconnected. And they bring them into the group and they have a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood, like, you're suffering and I'll tell you why. It's because someone stole your job, or it's because of these immigrants, or it's because of these women, you know. And we're together in our hate, basically. People feel brought into a community, understood, validated, seen unfortunately, the identity is based on hating another group or driving the blame into another group. But it's actually that sense of community and connection that they have in that hate group that is part of why, you know, impressionable young people get sucked into this kind of thing. You know, people obviously look for a simple answer to complex problems, and sometimes quite deluded, you know. But it's really sad that people become willing to die. I mean, their social bond, it's usually people who don't have a very, you know, who actually probably never had a lot of love and understanding and didn't feel part of the community, or didn't feel that their problems were addressed. And then they become part of a group where they actually feel their problems are addressed and they feel appreciated, even though quite often it's a very twisted form of dysfunctional parenting that is happening in this hate group. They feel supported, and then in the end, you know, they end up, I mean, they always recruit emotionally vulnerable people to carry out these kind of extremist acts, you know, that they become, because that bond that is so compelling that they become trained to do something very terrible, even die, you know. And that's why the army uses this kind of camaraderie amongst men or amongst women, so that you're willing to die for your country or die for your colleagues, keeping them safe in the group, you know. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, it's good if you're with, if you're more of the kind of person who feels overwhelmed by other people's emotions, that you're attachment avoidant, that you feel overwhelmed by your own emotions and you need a lot of space to process them. And that can sometimes happen too if you're on the spectrum as well, because your senses get overwhelmed, or you can't always read other people's emotions. You need a lot of space, and you're with someone who is an anxious attachment person. It helps to give them a time frame when they're getting anxious. You know, reassure them, I'm here for you, but I just need some time alone. It's not because of you, it's just because of my own nature, and also probably healthy to have time alone and develop our own lives. But I'm not going to just abandon you or not see you for weeks on end or not contact you. And when the other person is asking you what's going on and feeling that you're pulling away, feeling that you're distant, you know, be ready to sit down and talk about what's going on and share at least a bit, because otherwise the relationship won't be able to be maintained. And for anxious attachment people, you know, just kind of notice sometimes when you're making something bigger than it is, you know, and checking, rather than assume what the other person is feeling and do a big freak out, ask them what is going on and what they need and why they're doing what they're doing, you know, and ask for clear agreements about, okay, I'll call you in 3 days, or, you know, I'm feeling this. It would be helpful for me if you just talk to me about it, reassure me, you know, show some affection. But if you're an attachment anxious person, giving attachment avoidant people the space they need to a certain extent is important. Otherwise, they're going to run away. They're going to feel completely overwhelmed. And first and foremost, I think we need to kind of reparent ourselves and connect with a sense of wholeness, a sense of love, because that also can be very healing, you know, like, I think I said it last week, but Russell Brand, he said a lot of addiction has to do with a lack of connecting with a source of love, a source of meaning, a sense of joy, you know. It's a lot of pain and disconnection, numbing the pain, you know. So connecting with something higher than yourself, something peaceful, something loving, can also be very healing. And, you know, in Buddhism there is many different kinds of love. There is the 4 Brahma Viharas, which is loving kindness, which is the wish that others be happy; compassion, the wish that others be free of suffering; rejoicing, which is rejoicing in good deeds, virtue, which is the kind of meditation we did; and equanimity, So equanimity is what I would call good social attachment, healthy attachment pattern. It's not a sense of just not caring, not giving a a crap. It's really, and it's not about not feeling. It's really feeling, but just having the space big enough for the full emotional cycle to happen before you suppress or act out. Just allowing, it's having enough space in your head to process something without being overwhelmed by it. And it's the more balanced state of mind that can see the pros and cons, you know. The spacious mind. It still feels things. It still has a lot of compassion. It actually is a very deep kind of understanding. You know, Thich Nhat Hanh always says love is understanding. So when you can understand why someone is acting the way they do, you're not reacting, you're not taking it personally. Whereas when you're triggered and you don't have perspective, you're going to have a big fight and it's going to get quite ugly, you know, and you're going to maybe make it bigger than it has to be. And maybe sometimes it has to be, but if you need to set a boundary, or you need to cut someone out of your life, or you need to stand up and say something very strong to someone or something or some organization, that could be okay. But it should be well thought out beforehand. It should be coming from a place of wisdom, contemplation, and not hatred or having a grudge or wanting to do harm to someone. So I think that's my, I think securely attached people can have better connections, better relationship, you know, good parents, better life. And, you know, a lot of us don't have it, so get some therapy if you can, or at least read some books on psychology. But I think meditation also helps this idea of learning to be your own parent, learning to hold space for your own emotions, learning to be kind to yourself, you know. Loving kindness doesn't mean that you're perfect or that you're being narcissistic. It just means you're holding space. Like, even if I'm pretty crappy and neurotic and mixed up, I still have a basic goodness and I respect myself, you know. So we start from there, right? Like, you could be the most terrible person who's done terrible things, but from now on, there is some good in me, and I'm going to see the good, and I'm going to cultivate the good. Yeah. And, you know, if you can hold space for your own emotions, empathize. You can empathize with others. You can comfort others. You can comfort yourself. And when you can comfort yourself, empathize with yourself, you're more likely to not fall into addictions, and you're more likely to start to be able to working through your trauma, you know. So really, I mean, enlightenment, I think, is the process of the end of trauma, the end of suffering, you know. But there's a whole bunch of work that needs to happen between now and then, and we still have human needs. We need relationships, whether you're celibate or not. We need friendships. We need to have a healthy relationship with ourselves. And we need to respect and process our emotions, you know, and set boundaries, and also learn to be vulnerable with people we can trust, and learn to reach out if you're feeling isolated. I mean, I think loneliness is kind of an epidemic of the age, especially now that social distancing is happening. I mean, I think it's really sad when I think about all these Australian farmers killing themselves, you know, like men alone on a property, men who can't say how they feel. People who are at the pub when really they should be in a therapist's office, you know, people who've seen terrible things that they can't talk about, that they don't feel safe to talk about, people who feel that their pain, their abuse doesn't matter because someone else has it worse, people who are not hugged, who are not held, or who, because they weren't hugged and held, seek that kind of connection in more unhealthy ways. So, yeah, that's what I have to say about that. Does anyone have any questions or points they want to discuss?